This episode of the Tony Robbins podcast is brought to you by Tony Robbins Results Coaching. Are you ready to experience an extraordinary quality of life? Or maybe you're already doing well, but you know you can take your life to a whole new level. To do that, you have to set yourself up to win. You need a process, a way to consistently grow and produce the results that you need. That's what a Tony Robbins Results Coach can do for you. Whatever area in your life you want to change, your relationship, your health, your career, or your business, coaching is one of the most valuable tools you can have. It's an investment in yourself, and it can yield some of the highest returns. Tony Robbins Results Coaches are hand-selected and trained by the master of coaching, Tony Robbins himself, to have the skills that will empower you with supreme focus, powerful insight, and the accountability needed to achieve everything you've ever dreamed. To help you get started, Tony is offering podcast listeners a free results coaching strategy session with one of his top coaches. It's a $200 value, and you're getting it for free. Visit TonyRobbins.com/results. Schedule that free session today. Did you know that the average American checks email within 6 seconds of arriving at work? Or that 75% of adults say they spend the entire day within arm's reach of their phones? That means that you probably are never that far from your phone. Whether we want to admit it or not, our smartphone has become an extension of our life. And it's easy to understand why. After all, smartphones allow us so many communication options: voice, text, video, instant messaging. We have immediate access to the internet. You can do your banking, check movie times, you can access Dropbox, buy stuff on Amazon, check your heart rate, edit photos, publish blog posts. Pretty much anything you can think of, and you can do it anytime and anywhere. But what is this convenience really costing us? In this episode of the Tony Robbins podcast, we're talking with renowned social psychologist Adam Alter. Adam is an associate professor of marketing at New York University's Stern School of Business. He's also the New York Times bestselling author of 2 books, including his most recent entitled Irresistible, which looks at why so many people today are addicted to so many behaviors, from incessant smartphone use and internet use to video game playing and online shopping. Adam and I talk about the many ways our smartphones have become obsessive addictions. We look at how technology is precluding us from having a balanced life, and the serious implications this has on our social interactions with others and our capacity for compassion, empathy, and real connection. We discuss the role businesses play in perpetuating addictive behaviors by using strategic tactics when it comes to user experience. And we talk about what it would mean to withdraw from screen experiences and how we can all detox in a manageable way so that we can learn how to create a new sense of well-being in our lives. This episode is all about becoming more aware. Because the more informed we are about the addictive nature of technology, and even of the business practices that keep us coming back for more, the more able we are to demand more from ourselves, from others, and from the companies that we support. So, with that said, hope you enjoy this episode. Welcome, Adam, to the Tony Robbins podcast.
Thank you for having me.
No problem. So we want to talk about, in the very beginning of Irresistible, you cite a study that says that as many as 4 in 10 people have some sort of behavioral addiction. But how do you define addiction exactly?
Yeah, it's an important question because I think stereotypically we think of addiction as involving substances like alcohol or drugs or nicotine, whatever. But the truth is that addiction doesn't have to rely on substances at all. And that basically for something to be considered an addiction, what it does, at least as far as I'm concerned, is it needs to be an experience that you repeat over and over again compulsively in the short term that in the long term undermines your well-being in some respect. So the idea in the world of behavioral addiction, when we're talking about, say, screen experiences, is that we compulsively return to these experiences over and over again, things like checking our emails, being on social media, refreshing feeds, things like that. And we want to do that in the short term, but in the long run, it has some negative effect for us. And the 4 main areas where you see that are social effects, where it changes the way you interact with other people or the quality of your interactions. That's the most common. There are also financial effects where people might, say, play games where they end up spending way more money than they intend to. Psychological effects, for example, there's some evidence that when we spend a lot of time on these experiences, we have a lowered threshold for boredom, and that reduces our creativity. because a lot of creativity comes from sort of inhabiting that space where you endure boredom, but you're actually okay with it and you push through it. And that's where creativity comes in. And then the fourth thing is physical, where we say spend a lot of time in front of screens. We don't get up and move around. That's bad for our cardiovascular health, for example. So that's the broad definition, at least as it applies to behaviors.
Got it. So there's a bunch of other words that sort of get thrown around the word addiction, like obsession, compulsion, and in the Tony Robbins world, passion, right? So Tony likes to say, live with passion, follow your passion. If you're doing what you're passionate about, then it doesn't feel like work. And you had a great quote. You said, harmonious passions make life worth living, but obsessive passions plague the mind. What did you mean by that? And what are some of the difference in some of the, these words that we use around addiction?
Yeah, I think that's such a powerful idea. Passions are, as we think of them, usually really good things. And I think a lot of passions are good. Those are the harmonious passions you referred to. These are the things that are basically good for us. They are a big part of our lives. They make us who we are. They make us the sort of fulfilled, happy humans we hope to be. And, the other side of the coin, obviously, with passions is if you become obsessed, they can become obsessive passions. And this is when a passion gets in the way of your ability to enjoy other aspects of your life. A passion is obsessive if it starts to crowd out other very important aspects like spending time with family, exercise, the things that we want to do outside of those passions. You mentioned obsessions and compulsions. An obsession is really a mental thing. So you can be obsessed with something without having to actually do anything about it. It could be just an idea that plagues your mind over and over. And so in that sense, it's a little bit different from an addiction, which involves behavior. Compulsions are very closely related to addiction. So a lot of addictive behavior is compulsive. You return to it over and over again. But a compulsion, as we think, for example, of obsessive compulsive disorder, is a thing that you do over and over again, not necessarily because it feels good in the short term, but sometimes because it just is something that you feel like you have to do, even if it doesn't feel good. Addictions tend to be things that in the short term, we get some positive feeling from doing. And that sets them apart from compulsions, although they are very, very similar. So these terms are all aligned pretty closely, but they mean slightly different things.
Got it. Yeah, that's helpful. So when we're talking about addiction, I think a lot of us are familiar with like the chemical component. Like we know the word dopamine, and we know dopamine makes you happy, and it also makes you want more and more the next time. But in the book, you note that if this were actually the only factor for addiction, then every kid would be addicted to ice cream, right? The way that kids' faces light up when the first time they eat ice cream. But what else needs to be going on psychologically in order for something to become addictive?
Yeah, that is a common misconception that all you need is the right brain response, and I think that comes from the idea that addictions are tied to substances, that you say ingest some chemical and your brain responds to that chemical very sharply. It releases a burst of dopamine, which binds to certain receptors and you feel fantastic. And that's incomplete, as you said, because there needs to be a psychological component. If that were all we needed, as you said, you'd have kids who are addicted to ice cream, but you'd also have people who undergo surgery and then have pain medication. The pain medication in hospitals is very, very pure. They're very pure opioids. And when people leave hospital, you'd expect if that were all that was required, that they'd all become addicted to those opioids. But a lot of people go on and live happy lives without developing those addictions. And the real issue is that for something to become addictive, you need to have some psychological gap or some psychological deficit that the addictive behavior addresses. And for many people today, that may be boredom or loneliness or anxiety or depression. And so, using that example of recovering from surgery, if you go home and you have a lot of social support, you have a good job that you return to slowly, you have friends around, you have family, that psychological gap doesn't really exist for you. And so you get past the addiction pretty easily. You get past the use of the drug. For many of us, though, when we do have addictions, even if there's a mild psychological deficit, something like, we're easily bored or we're a little bit lonely at a moment in time, that's when the addiction kicks in. So it's not just the brain response, it's the brain response coupled with some psychological deficit that the addictive experience treats.
Got it. And that makes sense too, why one of the most common behavioral addictions in terms of technology is the internet, right? Because the internet solves that, the loneliness and the boredom. What are some other, common behavioral addictions that you discuss in the book?
Well, I think the earliest one that I spend some time on, but not a whole lot, is gambling. So gambling is a very well engineered experience that is hard for us to resist, because the people who create slot machines, for example, know exactly what they're doing when they program those machines.
Mm-hmm.
So there's gambling. There's also exercise now. A bigger problem in America and in much of the world is that people don't exercise enough. But there's now a new epidemic of people using, say, smartwatches and fitness devices that propel them to exercise beyond the point where their bodies are healthy. So I talk about exercise addiction. There's also work addiction, which is a big one. Being tethered to email, for example, after hours or at all hours. 75% of people say that they spend 24 hours a day within arm's reach of their phones, which means that they don't need to move their feet to access their phones. That's a staggering statistic. The idea that there's any device that 3/4 of us can reach at all times of the day, including in the middle of the night. So there's social media experiences. There's the other ones I'm leaving out. Those are really the main ones that
Yep.
I focus on in the book.
Yep. And it's interesting you talk about the phone because in many cases, actually in most cases, all of those things you just mentioned, you can do on your phone, right? You can gamble on your phone, you can play games on your phone, social media, you can, you be tethered to email because you're checking your phone in the middle of the night. Online shopping, right? There's just all of these ways in which the phone is the vehicle, right, for those addictions. So what are some of the things that you think people should do in order to reduce their addiction to their phone?
Yeah, it's really difficult. I've had maybe 5, 6 emails from people who say that they absolutely do not use technology at all, but it becomes the defining feature of their lives.
Yeah, like a Luddite.
That's how they are known. They say things like, "My friends know me as the person who's impossible to get hold of." And I would never advocate that. If that's something someone wants to do, all power to them. But I think an uphill battle. I think the smarter thing for most of us is to just carve out time that's kind of sacred during the day, that is screen free or tech free. As you say, these phones are just incredible delivery devices. They themselves are agnostic. They could deliver good content and bad content, and it just so happens that a lot of it diminishes our well-being. The best thing we as consumers can do, though, is to pick times of the day where we won't have our phones around us and where we'll be screen or tech free altogether if we can. The best way to do that, I think, as far as I've seen, is to pick something that happens every day, like, say, dinner time. It doesn't matter whether you're alone, whether you're with other people, whether you're at home, whether you're at a restaurant, you will be having dinner every day. And the best thing you can do is just to develop this habit where you will never have a screen during dinner time. You will not sit by the TV. You will not have a smartphone or a tablet. At first, when I talk to people about this, they experience a measure of FOMO where they start to wonder, what am I missing out on here? And that makes total sense. You get withdrawal from drugs, you get withdrawal from screen experiences as well. But very soon, after a few days, they say, that period means so much to me. It's so good for my well-being, even if it's just a half hour or an hour. It makes the rest of my day feel different. It makes that period feel so much more colorful and rich and interesting than it was before I had this policy. And I know it works because when you talk to people, a huge number of them will expand that. They'll either say, for the hour after dinner, I'm doing that now, or until I go to bed after dinner, I don't use my phone. Some people expand it to the weekend. They have these weekend tech sabbaticals where they'll say, this is what I do with my family now. I will put my phone on airplane mode on the weekend, especially on a Saturday. And the phone becomes a camera, so I can take photos. I have a 1-year-old son, and we love taking photos as we're out and about in New York City. But the phone doesn't ring. I don't get text messages. I don't check the internet. I don't check social media. And so I think carving out those times where you won't access tech is really, really important.
Yeah. And you mentioned that you have a son. How can you talk a little bit about not just the impact of reducing screen time for you to spend time with your family, but ultimately, what does that do for the next generation? Because I think something that anyone who sort of part of the older generations and was not, sort of born with iPhones and ubiquitous screens, we kind of wonder, we have nostalgia, right? We look back on a time we grew up without all of this, but we kind of wonder, how is this impacting a whole generation of kids, and we don't even know what the effects are going to be on them yet.
We really don't. We have a sense because there are piecemeal studies here and there that focus on certain aspects of tech use and how tech seems to influence us. But we don't really know. The kids now who are born into the screen era, when you talk to psychiatrists and say to them, or psychologists and say, what were the big points in time when you saw a big spike in our addiction to tech or our, tethering to technology? And they say the two biggest events were the introduction of the iPhone in 2007 and the introduction of the iPad in 2010. So the oldest kids who were born into this era are now 10 years old. And we don't know what they're going to look like as teenagers or as adolescents, young adults, parents, and so on. But we have a sense. So we know, for example, that, the way a lot of younger people communicate, and this includes people in their 30s and sometimes older, is to use this sort of toolbox that you get with texting. And the toolbox is really useful because it means that communication is very mathematically precise. So if someone sends something to me that's funny, I can respond with lowercase LOL. I could respond with uppercase LOL. I could introduce one exclamation point, maybe three, maybe five, and I can very precisely control the message that I'm sharing.
Sure.
Now that's great if you're averse to risk and you don't want to communicate something that you don't actually feel. But what happens is, if you're a young person and you've been doing this basically from birth, there are certain points where you will be forced to communicate in the nuanced real world in a face-to-face setting, and you won't be able to rely on that toolbox. But you may not have developed the skill that takes a lot of time to develop in communicating the nuances. So if someone makes a joke in your presence, there's the creasing of the eyebrows, there's the way your mouth moves, there's the sound that you emit when you laugh, there's the way your eyes move. And there are just a million little cues that are very subtle, that are very nuanced, that over time we learn to master. But if all you've been using is this toolbox of clinical communication, you don't learn that. And so when it comes to forming romantic relationships, when it comes to working with other people in the workplace and communicating with them and cooperating with them, that's something that I think this generation is going to struggle with more than any generation that came before it, because so many people are just avoiding those learning experiences that come from, to be honest, messing up when you're communicating face to face. You need to make those mistakes when you're young, otherwise you don't really learn to hone those skills.
Sure. Yeah, it's all about the nonverbal cues.
Exactly.
Yeah. One thing that's particularly scary is that you don't really fully understand the impact that your negative words have on people. So I don't know if you've seen that series, 13 Reasons Why. It's basically about, teenage kids and what goes on phones and on social media, and how, if you say something unkind to someone to their face, at least you can see the impact it has on them. But if you, as you noted, if you text it or if you put it elsewhere, you're sort of hiding behind this level of basically being anonymous. That's where things really sort of escalate.
Absolutely. I think a lot of pro-social behavior, being a good person, comes from not wanting negative feedback and not wanting to see that you're upsetting people. Most of us do care about how we make other people feel. And in order for our better angels to come forth, we need to be able to see how we're affecting people. And so in face-to-face settings, if you say something that's unkind, you will see very quickly that the other person is responding negatively, and you won't do that again. So kids learn that when they're pretty young usually. But as you said, when you're dealing with people through online channels, you don't see immediate feedback, and sometimes you never see feedback at all. It's just so easy to bully people online and not know what effect your words or comments are having. And I think that's one of the big problems for young people in particular, and why so many teenagers are struggling with this, is that they don't have an ability to communicate how they feel about a negative experience, and they also don't have a sense of how they're affecting other people. That feedback is so important, and it just doesn't exist in the same way, that with the same high fidelity as it does in the real world.
Yeah. So if you're a parent of one of these kids, what do you do? I mean, do you set limitations? How do you sort of, mitigate the negative consequences of what's going on?
It's incredibly difficult. There are no silver bullets here that make the problem all better. There are certain guidelines for young kids in particular that I think are pretty useful. So the American Association of Pediatrics has guidelines for screen use in young kids. They suggest, for example, that young kids under the age of 2 shouldn't really be in front of screens at all, if possible. And if they are, that there are parents there, adults there, to tether those experiences to the real world. So, for example, if your child is learning about the color red on a TV show, you then go and fold the laundry and show them socks and T-shirts and things that are red colored, so that they recognize that this online world is not its own genuine world, but just an extension of the real world. So they don't see it as an escape from the real world, which is one of the big problems today. In teens, it's much harder, though, because a lot of their social lives reside in that screen world. I think the best thing parents can do is to really understand and take the time to learn about what these experiences are. You know, it's so easy as a parent to just say, oh, Snapchat, it's just not my world. It's not something I understand. Kids today, basically, throw your hands up.
Mm-hmm.
But I think kids really respond when their parents understand what their worlds are like. And it is more difficult for parents today than ever to understand what their kids' worlds are like, to have a really informed, deep conversation about what their kids are experiencing. But I think it's on parents to make that leap. You don't necessarily have to sign up to these programs to communicate with your kids on them, but just know what they are like and what function they serve. Do a bit of reading. Use the programs themselves just to see what the experience of navigating them is like. And that way you can at least have intelligent conversations with your kids about them. And you can set certain boundaries as well, which I think is important. In the same way as you might set boundaries on your own screen use, like no screens at dinner time, you could do that with kids as well. You don't want to stunt their social lives, but you could say that, after school for a couple of hours, that's time to do homework, time to exercise, time to do other things that don't involve screens, that don't involve Snapchat, that don't involve Instagram and Twitter. And that will really, I think, help them to lead a more balanced life. You just have to be, you have to be the parent. You have to guide them in that.
Sure. So if we're setting limitations for the kids, and you're noting, we can set limitations for ourselves as well. But one of the things you mentioned is that it's really hard to police yourself because our brains convince us that we're right. We're making the right decision even when we're
Right.
not. So how do you take, some steps to get that self-control to stop?
Yeah, it's difficult. So one of the first things I did that was really helpful was I downloaded an app called Moment. And Moment was created
I have
by...
that. Yep.
You have Moment. Yeah,
I
it's
do,
fantastic.
yeah. Mm-hmm.
It's well worth using. And what happens with the app is it measures how much time you use your phone and how much time you're doing different things on your phone. So there's a systematic bias for us to underestimate how much time we're spending on our devices. And when I spoke to the creator of Moment, Kevin Holesh, he's a guy who creates various apps and tech experiences. And I said to him, I'd like to try Moment. He said, well, before you do, why don't you try to guess how long you're spending on your phone, on your screen? By the way, this doesn't include time making phone calls. This is really screen time. And so I said, well, I have no idea, but I'm going to guess an hour. And he said, okay, that's pretty typical. And then I downloaded Moment. I was using my screen from 3 to 4 hours a day. And that's routine and very common that most people massively underestimate their usage. So the first thing, as with any problem or potential problem, is to understand the scope of it. So Moment's a good place to begin. The next thing is, a lot of us try to resist temptation in our lives. And unfortunately, as human beings go, and as all animals go, our ability to resist temptation is limited. Some of us are better at it than others, but ultimately we will all fail eventually because we get exhausted. It's hard to do. The better thing you can do is to avoid having that temptation in the first place, which is why I said it's so important that you keep your phone for at least part of the day far away. Because if it's in your pocket 24 hours a day or near the bedside table, you will eventually struggle to resist temptation and you'll reach over and you'll grab your phone.
Sure. It's
but
like
if
cookies.
It's in another room,
it's like keeping cookies in your pocket if you're dieting. You just don't do that.
Exactly. Yeah. You just don't do that.
Yeah.
But if you put the cookies in a room that's far away or in a drawer that's locked for certain hours of the day, you are not going to have cookies. It's going to be much easier to resist. It's this very basic old school psychological principle. It's known as propinquity, and it's the idea that the things that are physically closest to us in space are the things that have the biggest effect on our lives. And so the smartest thing you can do when you're trying to resist temptation is to take the thing that you're trying to stay away from and literally put it far away from you. It's such a basic idea that most people don't even consider it, but it's really a good place to begin with any experience that's difficult to resist.
Sure. And you mentioned too that one of the difficulties is that you think there's this whole world going on that you can view through your phone that you'll be missing out on. And part of that is, posting, it's like quantifiable things, right? So you post something and you want to check how many likes you're getting. You want to, get to inbox zero. So it's almost like we've because like the phone is a way for us to constantly get that the feedback on how we're doing in terms of metrics, right? We have like quantifiable selves now. So, it's interesting coming at this from Tony Robbins' perspective because we love metrics. We think that, setting goals and achieving them is a positive thing. But this is an instance where, how much are we obsessing over these goals? And you talk about this quite a bit in the book. People are getting obsessed with getting more done in less time, and they're so afraid to not hit their numbers that they're, constantly checking and they're constantly trying to improve. How do we, either adapt or sort of make some sort of shift so that we stop obsessing over things like that?
Yeah, no, I'm very sympathetic to this issue. I'm a scientist, so everything for me comes down to the numbers.
Sure.
And I'm constantly monitoring every aspect of everything. So, I think the best thing we can do is try to live at least some of our lives demetricated without the metrics that you're talking about. And it's tough to resist. So here's an example that has really helped me. When I run, I run a lot and I like distance running. I have a watch that records everything. And historically, when I've run, and I've been doing this for the last 15 years or so, the watch goes with me wherever I go, and I'm monitoring my speed at all times, how far I've gone. And much of my mental space during the running is about what the watch is telling me. I can run past something that's outrageous and incredible and probably not notice it because I'm spending so much time looking at my watch or thinking about what's on the screen. Mm. And the best thing I did was a little while ago, this is a suggestion of a friend of mine, Brad Stulberg, and he said, what you should do, and what he's been doing is you tape over the face of the watch, and that way it's still recording everything, but you're not looking at the screen. You're demetricating the run, and the run will become more about what's around you, the scenery, whether it's nice outside, whether there are beautiful trees nearby, whether you happen to run by an animal. And he was absolutely right. I started noticing things. I've been doing this run in Central Park in New York for the last 10 years. And I noticed things for the first time the day that I covered my watch face that I had never noticed in 10 years. And it just gave me a richness to the experience. And I became much more in tune with what my body was telling me rather than just relying on what the watch was saying. And I think that's a good lesson for the way we live our lives, that by demetricating, you actually end up paradoxically focusing much more on how you feel during the experience. This is known as interoception. You focus much more on your own body rather than on what's going on outside. And I think it's a great idea. There's even a way to do this with Facebook now. There's a program called the Facebook Demetricator, which removes all the numbers from Facebook. So when you post something, if you're the kind of person who watches to see how many likes, shares, and comments you get, and you trace the number as it's going from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 and so on, or the worst case scenario, there's nothing there. You basically, by demetricating, don't have that feedback. And you post things because you want to post them, because they're things you want to share with people rather than because you're curious about how people will respond. And people use Facebook for less time when they use the demetricator. And when they report how they feel about their usage, they say they feel much happier because it's a more intrinsic motivation rather than trying to track your likes and comments. You're actually sharing things because you want to share them rather than because you want to see how people respond to them.
So you're going more by feeling than by sort of social validation or external feedback. Yeah. That's great. So, it's interesting that, we're talking about goals and talking about metrics because, like you said, you're a scientist and you kind of live by the numbers and you believe them and you work with data every day. And a lot of our audience, they're business owners and, their company is focused on goals and they want their employees to be focused on goals as well. So they would almost encourage these behaviors, not discourage them. But what do you do if you feel like your employees are burning out because of addictions to work, email, constantly striving for perfection? How do you address that issue in the workplace?
Well, I think in the workplace, email is the biggest culprit. It's bad for productivity from the entrepreneur side, and it's also bad for well-being from the worker side, the employee side. So just to give you a sense, Western Europe is way ahead of the rest of the world in this respect. In France, for example, the government introduced legislation in January requiring that any company with more than 50 employees has to draw up an agreement that explains how its employees will be protected from email between, I think it's 6 p.m. and 8 a.m., which is just a brilliant idea.
Yeah.
So what a lot of them do is they will batch emails that come in after 6 p.m. and they will only release them the next day at, say, 8 a.m. So their employees can go home, live their lives, knowing that they will not get a new email until the following morning. There are other great examples of this. One of my favorites is a Dutch design firm that has tethered its desks to the ceiling. And what they do is at 6 p.m., no matter what you're doing as an employee, your desk will rise to the ceiling and the room is converted into a yoga studio.
Are you serious?
Yeah,
so even if you're in
brilliant.
the middle of something, all of a sudden you just lose your workspace. It just starts, that's ridiculous.
Yep. Work ends at 6 and everyone knows that. So they start wrapping up around 5:45.
Sure.
And then there's also a brilliant email vacation policy. There's the car company Daimler in Germany.
Mm-hmm.
This is one of my favorite interventions, and I think there's something that we could all learn from this. And if I had employees, I would do the same thing. When Daimler's employees go on vacation, they automatically rig the email account vacation message so that it says the following: "Thank you for your email. This person's on vacation. We have deleted your email. It will not reach this person. You can send it instead to this other person who's not on vacation, or you can email the original person back on this date when they're back from their vacation." Now, the genius
That's brilliant.
it's brilliant because if you are going on vacation, one of the biggest things that people say is that I'm never on vacation because even when I'm not at the office, I'm constantly checking my emails. But if you know for a fact that you will not get a single email while you're on vacation, you will actually enjoy your vacation. And the people who work at Daimler say that this has changed their lives. It's like going back in time to a time before emails and smartphones when we could actually take vacations. And it's great also for productivity. So from the entrepreneur side, from the employer side, people are much more engaged when they're not constantly using email, when they don't burn out. We know, for example, that in the workplace, people check 70% of their emails within 6 seconds of their arrival. Now,
6 seconds? Wow, I think if you asked somebody that, how quickly it is or whatever, you definitely would not get 6 seconds. People would probably say, I don't know, 10 minutes or more.
Absolutely, yeah. I actually ran a multiple choice quiz where I asked people to guess how quickly we check our emails. Is it 6 seconds, 60 seconds, 6 minutes, or 60 minutes? And almost everyone says 6 minutes or maybe 60 seconds. But 6 seconds is crazy. And one of the problems with that is that when you stop doing whatever it is that you were doing before the email arrived, it takes you many minutes, that some people say 20 to 25 minutes based on research, to fully re-immerse yourself in the original task. So for productivity, from the perspective of an employer, the last thing I want is the people who work for me to be stopping every time they get an email and then taking 20 minutes to get back into the task they were doing before.
Yeah.
So what you should do as a company is try to batch your emails if you can. Say to people, for example, all company emails will be released 3 times a day. You'll have emails released at, say, 8 a.m., noon, and 3:30 p.m., something like that. And that way people know that once they've answered their emails at those 3 times, they have a good chunk of time to really get deeply involved in another task that doesn't involve email, that doesn't involve distraction. It makes the employees happier and it makes them much more productive.
Yep. It's interesting too because, people might be checking emails that quickly, but they're not responding to them necessarily. So that's another thing is like you'll get an email, you'll check it, you're distracted, you're thinking about responding, you're thinking about the task it's giving you, or you're thinking about, whatever it is it's about, but it's not necessarily like you're solving the problem and then moving on. A lot of times you do double the work because you go back to it at another time to address it. So it's really sort of reducing our productivity in half.
It really is. That's a really good point. This triaging process where you only answer the ones that are absolutely urgent is not useful. And one of the problems with it is that what you do when you check an email but don't respond to it is you open up a loop. This is the way humans work. We hate open loops. That if I know that there's a task that I need to complete, but I haven't completed it yet, it nags at me in some small way until
drives you nuts.
It
Yeah.
drives you nuts. So it's much better not to have opened that loop in the first place.
Yep. Right. So those are some of the negative implications of, technology addiction, particularly in the workplace. But given that we are talking to business owners, one of the things that has happened fairly recently is this whole gaming idea, right? So these game developers, they're businesses just like the rest of us, and they're just trying to create the best product. And for them, their goal is to get more players, more time spent in the game, because that's just money in their pocket, right? So if it's coming from direct sales or ad revenue. But beyond gaming, there are a lot of businesses that really would benefit from getting people hooked. And, it's interesting because the subtitle of your book is The Business of Keeping Us Hooked. So people out there are benefiting from this. So if you're a business and one of your goals is to get people hooked on your product, how do you know if you're going too far?
Yeah, this to me is the single biggest, and I think in many ways most complex issue that I've come across with this book is that you have a limited amount of attention as a consumer, and that quantity of attention is then divided across every experience that you have during the day, whether it's work or even sleep or different social media platforms, email, and so on. And so every company that's competing for your attention in this attention economy is doing everything it can. There's an arms race. It needs to be very effective. And so a lot of the programs that people are designing, that companies are designing, have to be mindful of the fact that there's a lot of competition for your attention. And so they're engineered to be very, very difficult to resist. Otherwise, they just won't be able to compete. So what do you tell a person who's creating this experience? I think, first of all, it's difficult to say, worry less about the bottom line if you're in business and worry more about how you're affecting the lives of your consumers. I've tried it before. It doesn't usually go very well when I speak to people in the industry.
Sure.
What I do think will change, though, and what I think is making me a little bit hopeful, at least, is that with this conversation comes a savviness to consumers that didn't exist before. And I think consumers are becoming more demanding. So if you think about the way our attitudes towards, say, big tobacco changed across time, or our attitudes towards companies that polluted the environment over time, we used to give these companies a pass. Big tobacco had a pass because tobacco was legal and nicotine was legal. And the companies that were dumping into the oceans and so on were also given a pass. But the way consumers demanded things of these companies changed. They became much more aware of what these companies were doing, and they recognized that these were issues that needed to be addressed. So now you cannot be the one company in the marketplace that dumps pollutants into the ocean and expect to still attract consumers.
Sure.
Consumers don't work that way.
Ironically, too, one of the reasons you can't get away with it is because of the internet. And it's because people are using their phones and Snapchatting everything. And so there's a level of transparency and consumer awareness that didn't exist before.
It's a really good point, yeah. And so I think with enough consumers who demand that companies preserve their well-being, or at least pay attention to their well-being, I think these companies are going to be forced to change their practices. So we could turn to legislation, certainly. You could ask the government to get involved, as has happened in France with that example with email in the workplace. But I think in time, there'll just be an organic change that consumers will demand from these companies that they are more mindful of consumer well-being. And it's already starting to happen a bit. It happens certainly with privacy settings. We demand certain privacy settings from companies, and some people boycott the companies that don't give us those options. And I think that's only going to increase. But from the perspective of a business and a company that's producing these experiences, I think it's really hard to say to them and to expect them to listen when you say this, that they need to just pay less attention to the bottom line and make a less engaging version of their experience. I just don't think that's likely to work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I know Tony just interviewed Joe Gebbia from Airbnb, and he's the head of product. And his job is essentially to make, the UI of Airbnb encourage the behavior that they want to see. So that's an example where there are people whose, their entire specialty is to guide behavior based on the product. So, it's so professionalized, and it's such a valuable skill that it would be hard to see. I know you mentioned there was at one point at Google they had like a design ethicist. So it was their job to say, okay, well, this is too persuasive. So do you think we're going to are there going to be sort of internal stakeholders within businesses whose job it is to sort of put the brakes on a little bit?
Well, this design ethicist at Google, a former design ethicist, his name is Tristan Harris, and I spoke to him and met him recently, and he is unusual, perhaps even unique. His story is unique in that he sent a manifesto to the people at Google saying, what we're doing here is bad for people, and I think we should reconsider it. And in his own words, he ran up against inertia. That you can't tell a large company that it should pay less attention to its shareholders' needs and to the bottom line and more attention to consumers. It just doesn't work.
Right.
So I think it's unlikely that there'll be a lot of that happening, and that it'll be moving the needle in a significant way. I really think what he's doing now is he's focusing more on consumers and educating them and getting them to sort of rise up and say, this is not okay. We need a situation where you're paying more attention to our well-being. There are so many small things, though, that companies do every day. They have so much data that companies like Airbnb will be able to test. They could change the color of some part of the screen. They could try 100 different colors and find that it turns out people click 10% more quickly if this is red rather than blue or yellow or green. And so we'll make it red. And if you add enough of those decisions together, those small changes together, you end up having this kind of weaponized, evolved version of the experience that is so hard for consumers to resist. And that's really what we're up against now. We just need to demand, I think, more transparency, and I hope that we become more educated about what exactly it is that these companies are doing to hook us. And that's starting to happen.
Yeah, that's great. So it's more of a grassroots effort, so pressure coming from consumers rather from the inside out.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Adam. To all our listeners, the book is Irresistible, The Rise of Addictive Technology and the Business of Keeping Us Hooked. Go and get it today. You've got an amazing list of endorsers: Malcolm Gladwell, Arianna Huffington, Adam Grant, who actually we just interviewed, Charles Duhigg also has been on the podcast before. So it's a huge, endorsement from lots of great thought leaders. And Adam, just out of curiosity, what are you working on next?
I think I'm still invested in this project. Yeah. I think it's something that I've been really interested in. The book's been out a couple months, and I've just been watching how people have engaged with the topic. And this is something that speaks to absolutely everyone, whether you're a business owner, whether you are working at a company, whether you're a parent, whether you're a child, whether you're a teen. This is not an issue that escapes you. And so I want to work more on this, get a sense of which companies are open to discussing their practices. And I had some traction. There are some mid-size and even slightly larger tech companies that have come wanting to consult and to discuss their practices. They are genuinely trying to do better. And that's really encouraging. And it means that I think I want to spend more time on this before I start thinking about what comes next.
Yeah, that's great to hear. I agree. You've just tapped the surface, and it's certainly a trend that's not going away anytime soon. And that you're really on the forefront of people trying to understand what it is, and how to take control of it. So I think that's great. All right, Adam. Well, thanks for being on the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me. It was great.
The Tony Robbins podcast is directed and hosted by Tony Robbins and Mary Buckheit. Annie Org is our editorial director and occasional host. The podcast is produced by Carrie Song and Tyler Culbertson. Jamie Carvajal and Adriel De La Torre are our digital editors. Special thanks to Diane Adcock for her creative review. Copyright Robbins Research International.